Paula?
Absolutely.
All right. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Michael Dickens. I am the chair of the Visiting Artist Speaker Series, the CECA Visiting Artist Speaker Series. Tonight's event is brought to you by Austin Peay State University's Department of Art and Design and CECA, which is the Center of Excellence for the Creative Arts. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Yuchi, Shawnee, and Cherokee First Nations on which we are organizing, learning, and broadcasting today. I'd like to formally welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for Design Week and for this evening's conversation with designer Paula Scher about her work in creative practice. This year's Design Week is a collaboration between Austin Peay, Murray State University, Western Kentucky University, and Eastern Kentucky University. So welcome to all of you that are joining us from there. And I know we also have many visitors tonight that are joining us from outside of those areas. So thank you all for joining us, and it's an honor to be able to share our renowned program with the rest of the world. Please follow CECA, the Department of Art, Austin Peay's Department of Art and Design, and the New Gallery on social media outlets to stay informed about our upcoming visiting speakers, events, and exhibitions. And when I finish talking, I'll drop some links in the chat for you. Tonight's format will consist of a talk by Paula and with some time for Q&A afterwards. The chat will kind of be turned off. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and feel free to chime in with a question at any time. I'll do my best to moderate the conversation afterwards. I know we'll have a lot of questions. I'm just going to apologize in advance if we don't get to them all, but we're going to try our best. So with all that out of the way, it's my honor to introduce our guest, Paula Scher. So Paula is one of the most influential graphic designers in the world. I cannot express the breadth of influence that Scher has had on not just the graphic design community, but on American popular culture. Her iconic, smart, and accessible, described as the master conjurer of the instantly familiar, Scher straddles the line between pop culture and fine art, and her images have entered into the American vernacular. I could go on and on with an extensive bio about all the projects and clients Paula has worked with and all of the awards and accomplishments that she has received. But that would take up a really good portion of this evening's time. And let's be honest, you did not join this evening to listen to me blabber on and on about someone. You came to hear our special guest. So it is my distinct honor to welcome the incomparable Paula Scher.
Thank you. Thank you. I am going to share the screen now and hope it shares. So here we go. So I've put together a talk about typography, really, that is indicative of the way I'm working now. And it's based on something I sort of discovered in 2012. And I'm going to take you back before then to talk a little bit about identities. The word logo was logos, and it's Greek. And it was a word that was used by Aristotle, and he used it to describe how to make an argument. And he meant an argument in terms of the law. And what logos means in loose transition is word, or how things are understood, which makes sense when things are called logos, because logos are things that are highly recognizable and represent something. And so you understand a product or a service or even a person by use of a logo very often. I'm starting here with a logo everybody knows to look at how things evolve over time. If you take Nike, for example, you know the swoosh and you actually have complete understanding of what it represents, because you know it represents motion and you know it represents a certain kind of athletic prowess, and it's totally tied to sport. And we know this because we've looked at about 30 years of advertisements with it. And that those 30 years coupled with this mark form the impression we have. If you were analyzing the mark on its own, you might think it looks like a check mark. You might not think it looks like speed. You might not know what in fact it is. You might not even think it's beautiful, but you can't look at this mark anymore and not recognize it and not respond to it. And that's what a logo should do. But logos, once again, evolve over time. And they, you know, if you look at where Apple was when they first started, my God, how dated that would look. And you couldn't imagine the computer company looking like that today. But they change it all the time. They change up the color, they change up the materiality. And they haven't had to go through as many iterations as Nike, but they've been developing this brand since I think 84, when the first Mac was launched. And you have to realize that that sort of time makes an identity very powerful. So I'm an identity designer, and I do things that are based on form, like the Citibank logo, which was originally the marriage of the Traveler's umbrella with Citibank, is recognizable because it's repeated so often. But it's really, you know, interstate typography with this arc drawn to sit over the two I's equally and make an arc over the letter T. And the reason I did that was that it was a merger between the insurance company Travelers and the bank that was Citibank, and a lowercase t had a little curved handle under it, and Travelers used to have an umbrella as their logo. So this was a metaphorical umbrella. And people at Citibank now, 20 years later, don't even know that the reason there was the arc over the T was because I was making a metaphorical umbrella. They think it was supposed to be optimism, or the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or whatever, because 20 years went by and Travelers is no longer part of Citi and nobody really cares. So you find that these things become parts of corporations that are absorbed into the culture over a number of years, losing why they were designed like that in the first place very often. I was interested in designing form for marks that could be readily recognized and understood. And these were, the marks I'm showing you were done starting from 1998 through 2012. And they were all very simple because they had to do complicated things. And this is a logo for a park in New York City called the High Line, which is an elevated railroad track. And it was easy to design because I knew I was going to use something with a railroad track, and it starts with an H. If it had started with an F or an S, I could have never done this logo. The logo came because I was lucky. Sometimes you're just lucky. I use typography to sort of create motion or a sense of spirit. So in this logo that was designed in, I think, 2000 for Jazz at Lincoln Center, the typography came out of the Z at an angle because it was sort of making a connection between a trumpet. Even though the Z looks nothing like a trumpet, the motion is sort of like the sound coming out at that sort of angle. And when I designed these logos, both Citibank and Jazz at Lincoln Center, they had color systems that went with them, but mostly these things were sort of plopped down in the corner of something or other. The Citibank logos were put in ads or against a blue wave background on the banks. The Jazz at Lincoln Center logo sat on the marquee of the building, and it was cut out and pops up in the air. It's still there as we speak. And other than that, they were plopped in corners of ads for musicians and performances. This logo, which was for Criterion, really isn't recognizable. It only really exists where anybody sees it on television, where it is, an animation. And you see this thing on the Criterion collection and great old movies. And it's interesting how people recognize and remember things. If I show the mark as a mark, nobody's ever seen it. If I show the animation, everybody's seen it. It's how you see and what you remember is what the identity becomes. The New York City Ballet was a movable identity because they wanted to be able to use it in every form of space in New York City. So it was stacked around 2 lines, around 3 lines, but it never animated because I didn't really do that much in the years I designed it. The Metropolitan Opera was the same thing. And it was really a logo that was designed to re-emphasize the name because the Metropolitan Museum of Art had stolen the name from the Metropolitan Opera. And the way they stole the name was that the Metropolitan Opera in the 60s and 70s used to be called the Met, and even before that. And then the Metropolitan Museum of Art made a really good shopping bag that said the Met really big on it. So people thought the Met was the art museum instead of the opera. So the poor opera lost its name, and now it's the Met Opera. And it's the Met Opera simply because we put the type together like this. And people now refer to it that way, but it's really sad when you consider they were originally the Met. So in 2012, I wanted to change all this. And I thought what was wrong with what I was doing was there was something very static about it. The thing I really didn't like about it is that I would design these identities, and the identities were more than logos. There were usually some form of layout system and ad system that went with them to promote things. And in-house art departments would form, and they would create these things, and they'd invariably change them. So they looked bad with the logos. And I felt like I had lost control of what I was designing, and that, in fact, I hadn't designed enough for my client to really behave properly. So I started to think about how I could make an identity that could have conformed to all different kinds of situations and look the same and be recognizable as the same thing, but be different and change form. So I've been doing something for years, and actually I'm due to do one soon, is where I take on a free job just for the purpose of trying to see if I can experiment with it to invent something. And I did this with the Type Directors Club in 2012. What I did is I got 12 people at Pentagram to take the letters TDC and to design them in a way that I set up, which was a series of concentric red lines around the letter forms TDC, and see how many they could make that would be different from each other, but still recognizable as the same thing. This was sort of the emblematic TDC I made. And then I gave them to members of my staff and told them to push it as far as you could go and to see if you could recognize it as the same family. And I began doing this, and there was a certain point where you didn't recognize them as the same thing. And when you didn't recognize them as the same thing, it meant the color had to be the same. Like if the color was blue, it didn't look like the same family. If you made curves, it didn't look like the same family. It looked like it had changed and it belonged to something else. That meant that I could work with these forms, and they could be part of a campaign to announce the show that would come out. And you're looking at actually the components of the actual show, all designed with a sort of guideline to these different kids at Pentagram who put these together. So this was a breakthrough for me because I realized that it's possible to invent visual languages that become identities for things that can actually, if designed properly, can be more versatile than one campaign, but can continue to change and evolve. So that after this point, I began completely thinking this way, and I'm still actually exploring the territory, which has turned more into typography than shape. I went back in 2014 to redesign Jazz at Lincoln Center because the typeface I showed you, which was Eagle Bold, began to look dated. And Wyndon Marsalis asked me if I'd like to go and readdress the logo. And we both agreed that it was time to get rid of at Lincoln Center because they really own jazz, and Jazz at Lincoln Center is the home of jazz, and you didn't really have to say it anymore. So we took it out of the name, and this is the original logo I designed, as I showed you. And we sort of rounded the letter form and got rid of at Lincoln Center, and the logo seemed more contemporary just in that subtle change, you know, that very pointed typeface to this more rounded typeface. And then what we did is create an alphabet where all the rounds are filled in with the square peg in the round hole, which was emblematic of jazz. As a matter of fact, the reason the logo is like that is that Wynton Marsalis, I had asked him when we first met what jazz meant. What did the word mean? What does it describe? And he says it's syncopation. And I said, what's syncopation? And he says it's when you've got a bunch of things in a row and one thing is off. And I said, what, like a square peg in a round hole? He says, yes, exactly. And that was where the logo was born. So here, the square peg in the round hole is one thing or two things within a letter form. And they have the regular typeface too, but I knew that with this business of having a complete alphabet, when the in-house art department began working with it, there would be more consistency because the type would be more recognizable beyond the logo itself. So that this was the beginning of creating alphabets for every identity I do. And I found that it not only built consistency, that the staff of the in-house art departments expanded and sometimes develop different weights of the typefaces so that these things become really living and breathing. And here you're looking at my, sort of examples of what you could do with this thing. And here's the in-house art department, with real life, photography that they've taken working with it. And that the thing is recognizable without the word jazz on it, which is sort of wonderful because the type becomes the logo. So the word Brubeck is also saying jazz, simply just because of the way that thing is set up. You're seeing it on the building and the street. Here was an interesting problem. The Philadelphia Museum of Art is this art museum that sits on top of a hill in Philadelphia. It looks like a kind of a big courthouse or a very official building. And if you think this looks familiar, the reason you think so is because this is where Rocky Balboa ran up the steps and jumped up and down in Rocky. That's where he used to exercise in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And people from all over the country come to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and they run up the steps and they jump up and down and they don't go into the museum. And they don't go into the museum largely because they don't have any interest in it. They think it's a big, scary looking building, and some of them don't even know it's a museum. They don't know what it is. They just think it's the place that Rocky jumped up and down. So my job as an identity designer was to try to get people to understand what this place is and why they should go there. So matters were made worse in that in Philadelphia, they don't call it the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They call it the Art Museum. So if you come into town and you take a taxi and you say, can you take me to the Philadelphia Museum of Art? The taxi driver says, where? And it's only within a half a mile of the train station. You can walk there. But the cab driver always says, what? And then you say it again. And he says, oh, you mean the Art Museum? And then he takes you around and up there. So I couldn't change the name of the museum because it involved all kinds of dead trustees where there were grants and things that were made to that, and it would screw things up legally. So I wanted to put art front and center. And the old logo of the museum looks sort of stuffy like the building. It looks like it's could be a historical society, or it looks like it could be a school, and or even a courthouse with that kind of an icon. And then right next to the museum is Drexel University that has this actually very silly icon, which the icons had to go because you can't have two animals in 2 blocks apart. So what we did is persuade the museum to emphasize art, and that Philadelphia Museum of would recede and art would come forward. And then to show all the different forms of art within the museum, we would simply show them by taking the letter A and attaching it to the word art and enabling everybody to know that there's 20 million different types of art in this place, and they are. It's an extensive, fantastic museum. And Frank Gehry has recently redesigned the basement and interiors of it and tunneled through the museum to make it even better and more extraordinary with new modern galleries, which are opening in March. So we made about 200 A's, and we thought, well, that would be enough for them. And they keep making them all the time because every time there's a new show, they invent a new A. We use the A in a corporate way on corporate materials, or I should say an institutional way. It's an institution, not a corporation. And then on tickets and retail components, we use the crazy A's. Here they are on buttons when you check into the museum, and on kids materials. And Frank Gehry even made a whole set of A's for his exhibit, which was wonderful. We gave him the layout, and he drew all these wonderful A's, and we made swag out of it and T-shirts, and it was just really a wonderful, fun time with this thing. But it becomes a game now in Philadelphia. It's completely recognized. Also, the font was redrawn for it, and that you begin to recognize the font because the cap initials are very short and low in relationship to the lowercase typography. Here it is on packaging, on tissue paper, bags, more bags, wrapping stuff. I began around the same time. I think Windows 8, I think I designed 2012 to 2014. I think it launched in 2014. Maybe been earlier than that. My dates are sort of mixed up. But it was after I did the Type Directors Club, and I was asked to create a visual vocabulary to connect all of Microsoft's individual products. And what you find out at Microsoft is the company is completely the antithesis of Apple, where Steve Jobs organized everything. So, there was a similarity in everything they did, and that he was sort of tyrannical about it, that everything had to look a certain way and be a certain way. And all the products were designed to have the same look and feel. And that's part of Apple's immense success. And Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and the person who followed him, who I can't remember his name, they had a whole different attitude about corporate management. They believed that the companies were more successful if the sub-brands had their own individual presidents, and the president should be allowed to design the company any way they want. So there was no relationship between any of the various brands. It was sort of a big messy soup, which I'm showing you here. Like, here's a Microsoft logo. It has nothing to do with Bing. It has nothing to do with any of the other little companies they have, especially Xbox. And Windows, which is their biggest selling piece of software, was an opportunity to redesign the logo and use it as a basis for the internal teams to redesign everything else. They didn't want an outside designer to come in and redesign everything and put it down the throats of the employees. What they wanted was some kind of guide where the employees could create their own logos, which is sort of hard to do. I mean, I really didn't know how to design a manual that would enable somebody to make a logo for a company unless there was some kind of premise or spirit that could be repeated and turned into some kind of construction manual. When I looked at the Windows logos that were done over history, the first logo was sort of just an eccentric window, which I liked. The second logo looked to me like they had just discovered that, this computer company was in the business of being bitmapped. And they had to make a logo that it wouldn't look like a computer unless it was bitmapped. So they did this thing. And then they must have thought that the logo was magical, so it should appear to be in motion. And then they had, they would sort of change it a little year by year and change the angle of the window somewhat. Then they stuck it in a button, and then they just took it out of the button. And I I said to them, you know, your name is Windows. Why are you a flag? You used to be Windows. Now you're a flag. And they realized that they didn't know why this thing waved, because it does. It's a series of curves and it waves. It doesn't have anything to do with a window. It looks like bent window panels, maybe. And I said, I think that's not what you meant. I think what they meant was that it was supposed to be a window in perspective, but they didn't know how to show perspective. And it dawned on me at that point that it was a good analogy, perspective for the business of Windows, because the software they make are really tools. They're not, the products Apple makes are objects of desire. You know, you really have to have your iPhone. You're totally addicted to it. None of Microsoft's, their output doesn't feel like that at all. Their output is a thing, you got it, you work with it. You don't think about it, you don't want it, doesn't say anything about your self-image. And that's very much the difference in the businesses. So I thought, well, I should give them something that's about perspective. And I'm looking at the product I was designing for, and this was what Windows 8 looked like in that year. They had flattened out everything. They'd gotten rid of all their sort of gradations that they used to call chrome, and they would put on all their whatever they were designing, and it was sort of an overabundance of it. And I thought, well, this is simple. The logo should be simple. And I realized that if we took this form and drew it in perspective, taking up the same sort of space, it could fit on a perspective chart, and that if the window could fit on the perspective chart, perhaps every other logo they design could be drawn into the chart as well. So we constructed this chart where things form. The Microsoft logo is in the middle, and all these other companies and subsets of the various pieces of software can live within this perspective chart. And what this was the same way of thinking about designing an identity is really what the Type Directors Club was, is how many of these things, at what point do they not look alike? And that there was experimentation. There were some things that you drew into the chart that just didn't look like the chart. So you had to abandon them as exercises. So I did not design any of the following logos. They were all designed in-house by the team, but they all followed the perspective rules, and that it was sort of, it freed them and enabled them to take it over. I think they're redesigning it again now, which they seem to do every 6 or 7 years with whatever they're making. But what I enjoyed about doing this, it was actually a visual language that I gave to an in-house art department and walked away from it, and they made everything else, and it really held together. And it's sort of funny, like the last logo looks like it much closer to the first than any of the others, and I think that that's sort of taking it back true to form. This is a project I worked on for a year in, I think, 2015, and it came out at the end of the year. I was designing a logo for the new school for social sciences. It's a school in New York City that has a lot of different schools attached to it, and the one you all know is Parsons School of Design. And Parsons School of Design is like the elephant in the room to the new school, because more people have heard of it than the new school. The new school actually bought Parsons in 1972, and it just overpowers the school. So the school wanted to capture its preeminence and to have the identities of Parsons and the new school designed in such a way that you could recognize the schools individually, but you also could recognize that the new school was sort of in a hierarchy. Parsons was under the new school. I went through their history, which I always do, and I really couldn't learn anything from it. It just looks like they changed their logo every 5 years. And, you know, some of the logos were okay, some of the logos weren't. Then I looked at the logos of lots of schools that they may compete with. And I learned that from this exercise, that if you were an Ivy League school, you tended to have a logo with serifs. And if you were not an Ivy League school and you wanted to look modern, you had sans serifs. And that's all I can say about this entire exercise of trying to see what was out there. I think school logos, by and large, are not that great and really could be improved. But with the new school exercise, I had 40 approvals. There were the heads of every division of every school. I mean, it was an amazing scene with these presentations, and sort of like going into a presentation hall with half of the orchestra filled. I mean, it was incredible. I had no idea that I would be having to get all of these approvals to do this project. The building, the original building of the new school, is this incredible, wonderful sort of Bauhaus building that was designed in 1920 with the square typography. And I wanted to use it, and the president of the school didn't like it. So I picked up the lines as a motif, the lines in the building that are highlighted. And there was a typeface that was designed for the school by a wonderful French designer named Rudy Bauer, who invented all these different weights for the various schools. And I wanted to work over it. Unfortunately, his design plan didn't work because when they made sign systems with it, you couldn't read them because the type was too complicated. So what I did is I took his type, I filled it in, and I made a hierarchy of the new school with 2 bars, and then made it capable of changing form depending upon how you had to use it. And then it became a connector to these other schools. And it was sort of a reasonable solution to the problem of sort of what the hierarchy is in relationship to the main school, the new school, and the various individual schools within it. And that was the comment of the 40 people who looked at it. They thought, oh my God, this is totally dull. So I said, okay, what about that? And they liked it. They said, give us some more. So then I did that. I started messing around with the letter forms. And then they said, well, this is boring. The O's are too round. So I extended the O's, and I extended them too far. And they went, oh my God, that looks terrible. They're too wide. So we took them back, moved them back a little. And this was a little game that went on between me and the 40 people that had approval for a period of about 3 or 4 months. And then I realized in the middle of this mess that I had made that I had 3 O's of different widths, which was very strange in typography. But I thought it would be possible to create an alphabet that used 3 widths of each individual letter form, and that the type would be set, through an algorithm, and you could control certain things with what's known as glyphs, meaning that if you have 2 O's together, you can make a rule that they can't be 2 different size O's. And I did this with the type designer, Peter Belock, who had designed the first font I showed you, which was, I forgot what the name of it is. It had a name. It had a girl's name. Irma, that was the name of the typeface. And this is now called New School, Neue, for the new school in German. And we set up the typography with the extended letter forms. And you'll see, if you look closely at the letters, that all the letters are somewhat different widths. And there was an ability to do all of this first by hand, to make sure that each school had careful attention to the choice and positioning. And then when you got into text and other sort of copy, the algorithm of typesetting took over. So this was the hierarchy of the various schools. One of the reasons I was doing this is that I wanted the schools to be readable, but more recognizable in totality, because half of these schools were going to disappear because they were merging one school into the other. So the names had to be changeable without you noticing, oh my God, they changed all the names of the schools, which this methodology actually worked. And it was a nice sort of way of organizing hierarchy. And here are three of the widths of the letters. So you can see 3 A's and 3 Z's. And here you see a complete alphabet with all the extended letter forms. And here you see it as typography. And what was interesting about this was that, like Jazz at Lincoln Center, you could recognize the school without a logo. The school had lots of weird stuff. For example, when you extended the W, and this is Peter Belock's sketch of it, if you space out and widen a letter form, you can't make a V shape at the bottom of the W's, because when you reduce it, it will fill in and look like a mess. So this was the controversial form of this widened W, which we deliberately used for new, in the W in new, and we were immediately criticized for making something that read the Neb School, is what everybody said. I really didn't think so, but people thought that because it looked weird when it launched. When you do something different, it looks weird. And this one looked probably the weirdest of anything I had put out. Here's a thinner version of the same type. And again, what it looks like is an alphabet and as words. We set the word flexible. I think you can do it in 13 different configurations based on those different widths. And with the algorithm, the word would not come out the same for, I think, something like 6 or 7 lines. It didn't repeat that easily. So this is what the identity looked like, what their stationery looked like, what their corporate press kits and their brochures. And at the point that I got to this, I began working with the in-house art department, who were terrific. And they began playing with this stuff and building it out. And it was wonderful because you could tell what school you were at without reading a logo. You absolutely knew it and could recognize it. It's all over the streets of Manhattan. You see it when you go down the block and know it's there. It's on all of their student materials and on the buildings themselves. And the buildings inside are wild. And some of these I designed, and some things are done with students. I had students do this water tower design that lives outside the building, which I love. And you don't see Parsons or the new school. Well, you do see the word new on it, but you have no idea what that says. You just know it's the new school because of what it looks like. And this is an elevator cage that I put their donors wall on. We had it painted with the red and white that said Parsons over the mesh, and then positioned the signs of typography on the elevator cage. And if you look very closely, you'll realize they hang proud of the elevator cage, and they're hung up by these very sort of thin wires that hold them in place. I started being really fascinated by working this way in terms of public space, because you can become obsessive and repeat things in dimension the way you can in graphics, and they become even more surprising. The Quad Cinema is all about the square. The Quad Cinema is a theater actually really very close to Parsons. It's on 13th Street in Greenwich Village. And it's an art film theater. And it was bought by a real estate developer named Charles Cohen, who collects movies and actually produces them. And he's been my client for a long time. And he hired me to do an identity for the theater and then do the environmental graphics inside. So I said, well, it's all about the square, the word quad. Got to make everything sort of square. We made a square alphabet. A lot of fun to make. Didn't make square bags. The square bags didn't hold enough popcorn. Tall popcorn box. But we did make square tickets. That was great. And the best part was that the theater itself needed an awning in front with the sign on it, and the awning was made with these tubes that are extruded, where the letter form sits at the very end. And I don't know if you can see under the A, but the A flips upside down because it has to be read backwards from the other side. So when you go into the theater, the tubes go all the way through the doorway like air conditioning ducts, and they repeat on the other side in the same capacity. And then there's the same typography permeates the place. the quad color is red and black, and the interior is decorated that way. And we made these square LEDs that we programmed with old films where there's a pattern and a methodology for showing the films, and they move very slow because they're old movies. But there's a way that the squares cut them up, and sometimes they repeat. I really love this project. It was so much fun to do, because once you got into the game of what is it, it's a square, then it designed itself. Here's the entryway to the theaters. The Q theater is one way, the U theater is the other way. The four theaters are the Q, U, A, and D, and they have lights inside. Now you're in the Q and the U and the A and the D. This sort of work is more fun than anything, because you're really playing a game with yourself. You've got your rules that you've set, and you want to see how far you can stretch it and what you can build with it and how you can play with it. And there's nothing better to work on. You know, and you just carry it all the way through to the bathroom signs. You know, you simply just don't stop with this. I started to realize that there was tremendous value in the recognizability of these kinds of identities in sub-branding. And the Expedia Group, which is owned by Barry Diller, owns all of these different travel companies like Travelocity, the Expedia Group, Hotels.com. The same person owns them all, and they're within this holding company that's called the Expedia Group. The Expedia Group itself is not, you don't recognize any of its products. It's got businesses within it. And the businesses are linked together by the fact that they're what's called business to business, or B2B. It means that the customer, the outer consumer, never really sees these businesses. These businesses help other things operate, and they work from the inside. So they had this logo that was Expedia Inc., and they had this, swooshy E, because I guess it represented travel. And then they had a bunch of things that looked like they all came from pretty much different companies, or not really well connected or well designed. And they didn't want to be confused. They didn't want their middle business to business identities to be confused with the outer brands that consumers used. So the goal was to make these things connected and to just say the names of the company. So to make them recognizable, we came up with a typeface that was based on this letter E that's very eccentric. We didn't really design the font. We found the font and drew the E, and found that the E itself could be the mark, and that in the alphabet, you would recognize the E right away, and that when you began to work with their names of their businesses, like Partner Central was part of Expedia Group, it became even clearer of the ownership of it by recognizing the E. So here's a list of all the affiliates and various businesses they represent. And in each instance, it's very easy that any word is going to have an E. So it becomes immediately owned by that identity just by virtue of setting type. Here's their identity system and their online presence. And this is the way they promote. And it's just type. You can also play games with it. This was a restaurant that exists in Chicago that is like a giant bazaar of food. You go in and they have all these various sections where you can get oysters, or you can get fried shrimp, or you can get some kind of barbecue. And it's really a place everybody loves to populate and pig out and get drunk and have a good time. And we created sort of the series of P's representing the word politan, which sort of means of the people. So we based it on kind of newspaper type, that we found different widths and weights for, and different forms, whether they have drop shadows or dots or lines or whatever you like about it. And they existed in tall form and short form. And we picked these things up and sort of dealt them out in different bars and parts of the restaurant. And this is how they all work together. Every height of the font has this many variables in them. Here are different P's at heights and weights, so you can see them together. And what makes it so easy is that everybody is making a special every day, the people who work in-house, and they want to be able to change it up. So they have this kit of parts that they can deal out to make whatever they have to say. And this is the way we design for other people to use it. If the art department's good, they'll play with this thing appropriately, and if they're not, nothing we do would be good. But this was actually pretty successful, and we really loved it. It was a sort of a powerhouse of design. The in-house art director did an okay job with it. Sometimes you just can't control that. But these are all the things we made. So the last project I'm going to show you is a project I've been working on for 25 years, and I'm still learning how to do it. Actually, it's 27 years now. The public theater I began designing in 1994. I designed it with this wood-based typography that I've always loved. It was from the Morgan Library, and the type was probably drawn in 1880. And I used all these weights together before I was even thinking about what I've been showing you. And I began to create visual languages with it just from using this set of fonts that came from the Morgan Library. I didn't redraw anything except for the logo. Everything was picked up and reused, and it was very powerful. And they became individual posters for plays, because the public theater is the place that puts on a series of shows each season, and then they have free Shakespeare in the Park in the summers. And the Shakespeare in the Park posters are really the only posters that people see, because these small posters are for individual plays that don't run very long, and there isn't enough money to produce them, and sometimes they're just a couple, and later they became just simply digital printouts. The problem with what I did with these posters, which are pretty much collector's items now, and a lot of them are in museums, the reality is nobody really saw them. You only saw them if you went to the public theater. They were never on the street because we couldn't afford to put them out there. They were in front of the theater, or they were inside the theater. And then they were reduced to very small black and white ads. So the only people that really knew about them were the people who went to the public theater all the time, or graphic designers who saw them in annuals. Then there was this show called Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk. And I did this poster for it, which just sort of was a big hit, and so was the show. And these kinds of graphics were all over New York City. And then other designers started copying them, which meant that the public theater lost its identity, because it no longer belonged to the public. If everybody's doing it in New York, then the identity belongs to New York City. And this was really terrible, because my intent was not to design something that was going to be imitated. My intent was to make something that the public theater would own. So after this happened, I think in the very late 90s, I began to figure out how to change it. Now, we did a huge campaign for the public, and there was so much of it that for this particular show that it made matters worse, because if you look at the first poster on the left, which was done for the public theater, the public theater's logo is on it. The second poster next to it, where more were reproduced, was when the hit show Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk moved to Broadway. And it never had a logo on it. It has the name of the Ambassador Theater on it, so you don't even know where the show came from. So the public theater wasn't getting any credit for this show by the time it hit Broadway. It was just another Broadway show that was a hit. So I really didn't do the public theater very much good with all this promotion. So I started changing it because everybody was copying it at that particular time. And we did these for a year, and they were so depressing that we got rid of them after a year. Then I began changing the type every year, but there weren't enough posters that were made where you could recognize them. Sort of the typeface was the same, like Hamlet and Space are essentially the same font, but they don't look as much alike as that public theater stuff did before it. Then I began doing them totally different, and that was even stupider. So around, I think, 2010, we designed the public theater lobby. And I was sort of shocked by how powerful the posters were, which we hung in the lobby, if they all overlapped each other. But then when they were separated, they looked like they were different. And I thought, what would happen instead of doing different posters for different plays, but what if I made an actual manual out of it? What if I said, okay, this is a manual for a season? The first thing I tried was making the signage for the park out of the typography, and then seeing that you can totally recognize it as the same thing, and then doing a lot of the posters and promotions out of the same thing and holding it together. And then for the season posters, I flopped it. So we made these sort of massive system of posters that all look very much alike. I didn't quite have it right. The next year, I got sort of more specific and began doing these skewed types that went to the left and the right and stacked. And this is what the season looked like. And then the posters were for individual plays were, also stacked and crazy like this. And people started to recognize them. And people in the theater started giving these names, like they called this the slanty season. Then the next year I cut through the type and they started calling this the slashy season. And all of these became year identities for these plays where everything was collectivized. And we, instead of selling individual plays, we sold seasons. The advantage of this was more people saw it because if you went to one thing, you saw all the things when you went to the theater and you began to recognize it. You also began to recognize it in small print advertising because there was so much of it when everything was collectivized. And then a peculiar thing began to happen. The attendance of the theater went up because more people joined it. They saw it as a collective. It's an organizational theater. It's not about hit plays. It's about developing plays, and they're very good ones. And all of a sudden, I realized I figured out how to do my job that I'd been doing only for 20 years at the point this became successful. So I've been doing this ever since and trying to grow it. And we have done seasons that were really very close into what I was doing originally with wood type like this one, but the posters are so consistent that you recognize it as a season. Or we began animating them because there became digital media on the street. And for the first animated one, I made this exceedingly long B, and then it became a basis for doing the typography for everything. And I built an in-house art department at the public that I work with on a daily basis. They send me these things and I look at them on iPhones and I say, well, move it a little to the right or what have you. And it really has been, it's been so much fun doing this. This was 2 years ago. It was really all of last year before COVID. And I was doing the new season when COVID hit. So I had designed this set of posters and they never got made because there was never Shakespeare in the park because the park was closed because of COVID. And it just broke my heart. And the whole theater was depressed because there could be no plays. And then we decided, okay, let's get used to the fact it was virtual. And by a happy accident, this is probably the best digital campaign I ever did for the public because the style of the typography was simple and easy to work with and looked very good in these sort of like little daily hits. And the season is now coming to an end, and there's going to be Shakespeare in the Park in July, and we've come full cycle. But this is all really just one living, breathing identity. So, here they come, more and more and more, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. I'm going to do this on behalf of the 189 people that are here right now. I'm going to do this. I know you'd mentioned your love of wood type, and you mentioned it in the documentary that's on Netflix too. And I'll post a link for those who haven't seen the documentary on Netflix. I'll post a link in the chat. But you have a standing invitation if you ever want to work it with wood type. Austin Peay has the second largest collection of wood type of any university in the country. Over 60,000 piece collection of 19th century wood type. So standing invitation anytime you want to come work with it.
Great workshop.
Yeah. So there's several questions that have been popping up, and there's a great one that I think a lot of our students would benefit to hear in your response. So this person, you're clearly a visionary when it comes to understanding brands and crafting identities. When it comes to your team, who do you find you work best alongside, and what skill sets do you find make the best design team members?
Well, a lot of my team I taught. I just lost 2 associates who were with me for 8 years. One went into his own business, and the other got hired for a lot of money from Apple. But and I have another former student who replaced one of them. Like, so I teach at the School of Visual Arts and have for years. So I have former students that I've trained who come to me, and they sometimes intern. And then when they intern and they get good, they become a junior designer. And then when they're a really good junior designer, they become a senior designer. And then when they're a really good senior designer, they become an associate. By the time they're an associate, we know each other so well that they know when I say, oh, that's not big enough, they know how big I mean it to be. You know, like there's the kind of understanding, it's a visual understanding. I had the fellow who went to Apple was named Jeff Close, who I worked with on Parsons, among other things. And I could say 3 things to him, and he could sit down and know what I meant and make it work. And the ones who are interns and designers sometimes have very good skills, but don't know what I mean yet. So they learn it, and then that they grow into it. And then they leave and they go all compete with me.
How was that working out for you?
Well, I always used to win, but now I'm not so sure.
Another question that was sent to me before is like, as an identity designer, how often do you go to the actual geographic location to study the place beforehand? You had mentioned Philadelphia and the art museum and listening to the cabbies and what the locals call it. How often do you actually go to the physical place? I know when you're in New York City, it's a lot easier, but you know, places like Philly or outside. I'm
designing an identity. If it's a place, I go there. I mean, you just can't. You have to know that. And you know, I have to interview people. I mean, I literally had 40 approvals on Parsons. It happens to be on Fifth Avenue, so I didn't have to go very far. It's like a couple blocks from Pentagram. But you know, there are 40 people involved in that decision-making process. You have to know how they think, what they want. And I'll tell you, the new school got killed when the identity launched. Like everybody said, it was terrible, blah, 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 blah. And then the students graduated and then everybody liked it. If I didn't have, I'm serious, this really happened. If I didn't have 40 people behind me, I would have been killed.
Right. So during COVID, how has your design process changed when working with a client, and what has it most impacted?
Oh, it's been pretty awful. First of all, if I don't know the client, the client's new, I have a much harder time making connection. I found in the first 6 months of COVID, I got the same kind of job over and over again. They were all not-for-profits. They were all sort of cultural identities. The calls were directly for me. I wasn't competing with anybody, and I just did the jobs. And I think in a funny way, I liked the work I did during that period. And I think Zoom helped because everybody was so anxious to get off of it. They made their decisions faster, and I made the meetings shorter and actually easier to do the job. But the second half, it's just the opposite. The jobs are bigger, but the competition is stiff, and I don't really meet the clients, and I feel like I can't make as much a connection with them as I used to when I was in person.
Right.
And then, of course, with my staff, it's more difficult because we are designing like this. Can you move it to the left? Okay, I can't get that to move. Do you want to take a picture of it? No, let's go back on Zoom. Let's move it up. You know, you can't, something I would do in a minute behind somebody's back, or they would be able to show me in 5 seconds is, you know, it's like an hour can go by in some of these situations. Right. Very depressing, and not a great way to work. I don't like working remotely at all. Right.
So let me ask you this. So I know the relationship that you have with the client is paramount, right? So, but in a situation such as Parsons, I know you had 40 decision makers. How do you kind of break through and like, what's your I don't know, technique or advice for dealing with, gosh, bureaucracy, but even trying to convince 40 people when you're used to having that one-on-one with the decision maker?
Well, in fairness, there was a core group of about, let's see, there was the dean of Parsons, the dean of the whole new school, the president of the new school, the communications chair of the school, and what are they called? It was an advisory, somebody who was a trustee. It was a trustee. So there's a trustee committee. So the person who was on the central committee was a member of the trustee committee, and she represented the trustees. But the trustees I had to deal with individually. Like you would have weekly meetings with the small committee, and then you'd have you'd have the full 40 people, and they'd come in, and I would give a presentation. And I knew some of the people on the board because some of them were designers who went to Parsons, who had money, you know, and got on the board. And then there were other people like who I just made friends with. Like there was this wonderful woman who was the head of the fashion department who I just really liked, and we sort of clicked and connected. And she would defend me, you know, like she would sort of stand up and, you know, because it was a massive amount of people, but I'm comfortable in front of groups of people, and I can be funny in that situation. And so it would be more like a class, like I would be showing the work and there would be a class and somebody would say something and I would make a little joke about it and somebody else would laugh, and it would sort of diffuse the behavior around it. And mostly it moved along. Right.
So another question, and it's kind of hits on the piece behind you. So has the shift in thinking about type that you started experiencing in 2021 affected the way that you paint your maps at all, or any other personal creative work?
No, it has no effect on anything. No, they're totally different sides of my brain. I mean, maybe it does. If it does, I don't know it.
Right. So has, and this goes to another question. So in this kind of era right now in COVID and lockdown, and you're not being in the city and you're in your own space, have you taken on any personal art and design related projects that you've taken on during COVID just to make the work for work's sake or for fun? I know you're working a lot on the paintings behind you.
Well, the painting I was doing before, I was working on a series of paintings of hurricanes that are in the room that I'm working on. And then I got this commission to paint a Porsche. I'm wondering if I can I may be able to get a picture.
Yeah, a Porsche, not a porch, right?
This German collector. I'm going to see if I can get this, if I can share my screen again. Yay. Okay, you're going to see the front end of a Porsche. Here it comes. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So I've been painting this car. I got another photo of it here. So there's a picture of the front end of the car.
Is that like a 1977? I was close.
Yeah, it's a classic. see if I got another image of it. Okay, this is sort of an overview of me painting it. If I can get it on the background, let me get rid of this. Sorry, guys, I have no idea what you're seeing. Maybe just
Yeah, we're seeing you, but we saw the front end of the car. Is this a specific COVID project that you're like, now I have kind of maybe a little bit more time to take on, or is this?
I'm doing it on weekends, like I'm doing it on my
Oh my gosh!
But I love it. I mean, it's making me happy because I'm unhappy. My design work is social. I work with clients. I work with my team. It's incredibly social, and I'm not social with them. I'm talking into a little box like I am to all of you.
Right.
Here, I'm painting an object and it's physical, and I wouldn't do it any other way. I don't do this with a group. So it's, it's just a different thing.
Right. Well, let me ask you this then. So, do you ever feel uninspired during a project? And if so, how do you get yourself out of it?
That's, I thought I almost made you go away. No, you're here. Okay. All's well. I've had clients that are just so tedious, that you think, oh God, I can't bear to talk to them for one more moment, and projects that I found to be incredibly dry. And I sort of slog through them. Sometimes I find a way, there was one actually recently that happened where the clients were long and boring and long-winded, and the meetings were stupid and took too much time, and I wasn't learning anything from it. And then I went to do the design, and I actually began to like something I was working on. So that if I see something within the work, it can re-enthuse me, which is hard and during COVID, because you're isolated. And so even getting the thing started when you find the client boring and tedious, and you're not even that interested in what they do, that's, and I'm wondering, why am I bothering to do the job? Is really how I'm thinking during that. But then I found a germ of something that sort of made me interested, just because I had a good idea.
Right. I know we have a lot of undergrad design students here with us tonight. So how do you foresee the future of design, and how can these students prepare now to fill those roles? Like, what do you see coming in the future?
Well, obviously so much is digital, and mostly you're designing for Instagram, and you're designing for small little spaces that move. And I am too. I recently did this public mental health campaign that's really lives on Facebook and digital media. And these things are great to do. The problem is that they're very temporary and they disappear. So it's hard to have an impact. I think that a really exciting future is in environmental graphics, which has gone through a renaissance. It's a very creative area. The projects take longer to accomplish, but it's an opportunity to make something that lives in the real world. And so that's an area that you can go into and develop and play with and grow with.
Right. So with your jump in with the all the digital tools, I'm kind of paraphrasing a question I saw in the Q&A. Is do you start with sketches in an art journal, or do you have a sketchbook? I mean, how do you start? Do you just dive in straight up digital, or?
No, I'm looking right here. I'm like drawing all the time. I'm like, I start thinking like this. This actually was turned into a logo system. It was like a bracket that became a C. That's a logo for a company called Courage, and this is sort of their system.
Right.
I do that while I'm on the phone.
Right.
If you and I were just talking on, see if I have like tons of sketchbooks up here that are filled with crap. That's what I do, like little pieces of paper.
Right.
What's in here? I don't even know what's in here. Oh, this one's new. See if we got another one around. Let's see what this one is. So this one just has notes from meetings.
Right.
Then there's sketches. Here's the 295 from this building on Fifth Avenue.
Right.
There's like, but there are jobs in here.
So when you're drawing these little systems in the C, like the bracket that became the C, how do you explain the value of type to a client who doesn't really understand its importance?
I don't think that's so true anymore.
Yeah.
That was much more difficult back in the day. I think that the project I showed today that probably gets me the best and highest paying work was that Expedia job.
Really?
Because it was a real business job where the typography did the job of the recognizability. And if you have a big company and it has a lot of those sort of hidden sub-brands that have to be connected, you recognize it as the way. You don't know that coming into the room that you should ask for that. But when you see it, you know exactly what it does, particularly if you understand how a corporation is structured. So that I think that clients recognize typography. Clients know that fast visual messaging is absolutely imperative to them, and that this is the best time for typography in my whole working life. I mean, there are more people developing fonts. It's easier to do. The equipment is terrific for it, and there's a wonderful course at Type at Cooper where you learn how to digitize it and program it and design, and you beat out the type companies who charge you for these incredible licensing fees. Like it's cheaper for the client in long term to have the typeface designed for them and get it than they own it. Otherwise, you're paying a licensing fee every 3 years. I mean, if I look at poor Shake Shack, they started out with 2 people, and now they got to buy that typeface every 3 years. They'll buy Neutra every 3 years. They're going to get sued by Neutra. I mean, it's by their House Industries. I mean, it's a terrible mess with that I think Jonathan Heffler created. I mean, all of a sudden I kid you not, there are type companies who've gone to the Pentagram website to make sure that we paid a royalty or whatever we did on every font we used to check with the client. I mean, it's scary stuff.
I'm coming back to think of our audience and the students. We all know that being a good listener, right, is a great part of being a great designer when you're listening to clients' needs. So what skills, besides being a good listener, what skills are the best ones you think for a young designer to have?
Ask a lot of questions.
Right.
You'll find your clients like to tell you. Ask a lot of questions about who they are, what they do, why they want to do it, what do they like. You learn a lot.
There's a lot of questions. I know we're not going to get to them all. Do you have time for a couple more?
Sure.
Okay. Oh gosh, there's a lot. Trying to get some of that. What any influences that you've had that have surprised you over the years? Like, is there something that has spoken out to you that you didn't find an interest in before until it just surprised you that you were really interested in something?
Sure, Helvetica. No, I started out hating Helvetica. I actually love it. I think it's a beautiful font. I never will work with it, but I'm interested in things, design with it, and I know how to use it, and I think it's fascinating. The real surprise for me was environmental graphics, because I wasn't trained as an architect and I was really afraid of a third dimension, and I started building things. And I found I could do it. I feel completely comfortable going into a situation with an architect and making suggestions of things that sort of intersect with the architecture and know how to do them. And I know how to light them. And I built my own, I designed and built the house I'm living in now. I mean, I know how to do this stuff. I didn't know how to do any of that. I didn't learn that in school.
Right. Yeah, the quad cinema job is phenomenal. I just want to go and just to sit in the lobby and watch that TV screen, and just everything about that was just on point.
That was a gift of the job. The client, Charles Cohen, gave that to me. I mean, I worked with him and he knew I'd want to do it. So it was a perfect little job. You don't get those. That's an unusual job.
Right. So I think maybe one of the final questions we'll wrap up with, because I want to be respectful of your time. With there being a lot of graphic designers in today's society, I know a lot of students come in, they're graphic designers because a lot of their parents tell them that's where the money's at, right? Versus being a studio artist. This is a really big question, but are there any tips that you have to create original ideas?
There are no original ideas. We all stand on each other's shoulders. I mean, the idea that you're going to sit in your bedroom in your underwear and think of an original idea is just not realistic. What you're going to do is you're going to see something and it's going to inspire you to do something. And if you make something that looks exactly like the thing that inspired you, well, that's not so great, but likely you won't, because you'll fail. And because you failed at trying to do this thing you thought you saw, you'll invent something new.
Right. So failure is good.
Failure is a really good thing.
Failure is great.
That's where we make discoveries.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. This was phenomenal. It's nice to finally sit and chat with you. In the chat
person, I know we tried that, but it's a shame.
Oh, I know. Like I said, the standing invitation. If you ever want to come down to Tennessee and play with some wood type, we will hook you up. We'll do it. Just say the word.
There are a lot of questions here. Oh, this is
yeah. If you see one you want to pick out while I'm chatting.
Yes or no one. So okay. Say what's the best advice for young guys? With high competition, do you pitch work? No. Okay, there was one. Great. Thank you for taking time. Has this quarantine given you an opportunity to record? No. Well, I sort of answered that with the car. Okay. You talk about building offices. Do you have experience with working with a different language or ability levels? How do you approach that when building a brand? I haven't really ever confronted having to design in a different language, only in translations of language where we drew an alphabet that contained another, like a Japanese font or a Chinese font or something like that. But I don't ever design with words like that. And I think I'd really be lost. Have I done work in other countries much? Not that much. We have an office in London, and sometimes I collaborate with my British partners in Europe, but not really very much work. Let's see, what are you reading right now? Nothing. I'm not reading anything right now. I read newspapers all the time.
You're too busy painting a Porsche.
Why painting a Porsche? No, I read a lot of political stuff.
How's that working out for your mental health?
It's making me crazy. I'm mad and annoyed all the time. Okay.
Yeah. So for everyone, if you haven't, I know many of you have probably seen the documentary on Netflix, the Abstract series. I put the link in the chat in case you haven't seen it. It's great. I'm also going to, in the chat again, post all of our social media accounts, so please stay in touch with us. Follow us to keep abreast of all we're doing here at Austin Peay, and with fortune that we have the Center of Excellence for the Creative Arts that provides excellent funding for to bring these speakers and do these events and workshops. I'm also going to put another one. I'm not sure if I can copy and paste. Yeah, no, hold on. Oh, at APSU Graphic Design on Instagram. So follow that, so at least the students can get together and maybe collaborate with other students. That'd be great. Paula, thank you so much. This has been great. Enjoy your time painting the Porsche, not being in the city. Try not to read so much political stuff. Stay calmer. I know it's hard. And yeah. So thank you again so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And
good night.
I wish I could say so long.
Yeah, good night, everybody.
Take care. Bye.